The distant sound of oars cutting through dark waters echoed through the morning mists of northern Europe. Over 1,000 years ago, that sound, seemingly innocent, was the harbinger of terror for millions of people in medieval Europe. It was the sound of the Vikings approaching. Why were these Norse warriors able to dominate seas and lands, from the coasts of England to the depths of Russia, for more than 3 centuries? The answer lies not only in their legendary ferocity, but in a revolutionary combination of technology, tactics, and mentality that transformed them into Europe's first elite soldiers. In the late 8th century, something extraordinary began to emerge from the icy mists of Scandinavia. It wasn't just another warrior people, Europe was full of them. It was something completely new, a military force that combined revolutionary mobility, superior technology, and a combat mentality that would leave their contemporaries bewildered. The first sign of this new reality came on June 8, 793, when the monks of Lindisfarne Monastery saw something impossible on the horizon. Ships appeared from nowhere, like ghosts emerging from the morning fog. It was the beginning of the Viking Age, and the world would never be the same. Viking superiority was not a product of chance, it was the result of centuries of evolution in an environment that forged only the most adaptable and effective. In the frozen fjords of Norway, the dense forests of Sweden, and the wind-swept plains of Denmark, geography itself conspired to create a unique race of warriors. Growing up in a land where winter lasted half the year, where every piece of arable land was precious, and where the sea was both highway and battlefield, created special conditions. Here, in the long polar nights, young Scandinavians learned early that survival depended on 3 things: strength, courage, and tactical intelligence. There was no room for the weak or hesitant. During the endless Arctic winters, when darkness dominated the land for months, young Norsemen spent their hours sharpening not only their blades, but their minds. In the great communal houses, lit only by the central fire, veterans told stories of battles, each narrative a lesson in tactics and strategy, absorbed by attentive ears. It was a society where military skill was not merely valued, it was a matter of survival. A man who could not fight failed not only as a warrior, he failed as protector of his family, his land, his honor. And in Norse culture, honor was more precious than life itself. But there was something more that distinguished the Scandinavians from other warrior peoples: their intimate and ancestral relationship with the sea. While other Europeans saw the ocean as a dangerous barrier, the Norse saw it as a highway, an opportunity, a tool of war. From an early age, every young Scandinavian learned to read the winds like others read books. They knew every subtle change in the waves, every variation in watercolor that indicated depth or danger. This intimacy with the sea would give them a tactical advantage that their enemies could never match. While the land armies of the time were limited to known roads and predictable mountain passes, the Vikings could appear literally anywhere there was water. Rivers, coasts, even small streams became potential invasion routes. This naval mastery was not merely technical, it was philosophical. The Vikings developed a three-dimensional warfare mentality centuries before such a concept even existed. They could attack by land, by sea, and through combinations of both in ways that completely confounded their adversaries. The first great secret of Viking supremacy was their revolutionary naval technology. The longship was not simply a better boat than others. It was a completely new weapon of war, an innovation as radical as tanks or warplanes would be in later eras. With their prows carved into dragon heads, they appeared silently at dawn, gliding through the water like predatory serpents. But the true genius lay not in their intimidating appearance. It was in their revolutionary design. The secret of the longship lay in its unique construction, called clinker-built. Instead of joining wooden planks side by side, as other shipbuilders did, the Vikings overlapped the planks, creating a hull that was simultaneously incredibly strong and surprisingly flexible. This flexibility was crucial. When enormous waves struck the ship, instead of breaking rigidly, the hull would bend and absorb the impact. It was like having a ship that breathed with the sea. But most impressive was the incredibly shallow draft of these vessels. While Mediterranean ships needed deep ports and elaborate docks, a Viking longship could navigate waters only 1 meter deep. This meant they could literally beach themselves, allowing warriors to leap directly onto the sand, ready to attack. There was no need for anchorages or complicated landings. The true secret weapon of the longship was its extraordinary speed. Modern experiments with authentic replicas have revealed that these ships could reach speeds of up to 17 knots, about 30 kilometers per hour on water. It was faster than many steamships of the 19th century. In 794, just 1 year after the attack on Lindisfarne, Frankish chronicles report a revealing episode. A Viking fleet appeared on the southern coast of France, but upon seeing Frankish troops positioned to defend it, simply disappeared. The Franks organized a naval pursuit, but couldn't even approach the Norse ships. Emperor Charlemagne, witness to this event, would have said prophetically, "I do not fear that these bandits will harm me, but my heart grieves to think that even in my lifetime, they dared attack this coast, and I am horrified when I think of the harm they will do to my descendants and subjects." Charlemagne had understood something fundamental. He was not seeing just some opportunistic pirates, but the birth of a new form of warfare. One of the most ingenious innovations of longships was their dual propulsion system. Each ship possessed both oars and sail, allowing incomparable tactical flexibility. With favorable wind, the square sail allowed fast and economical navigation. Without wind or in narrow rivers, oars provided precise control and constant speed. This versatility completely transformed tactical possibilities. Vikings could sail against the wind, travel up rivers against the current, or make precise maneuvers in naval combat, capabilities that left their opponents completely disoriented. More importantly, the symmetrical design of the longship with bow and stern practically identical meant the ship could reverse direction instantly without needing to turn. In combat or flight situations, this capability was literally the difference between life and death. Viking naval genius went beyond pure speed. These ships were also revolutionary logistical machines. A typical longship could carry between 50 to 80 fully equipped warriors, along with supplies for weeks of campaigning. It was like having a mobile battalion that appeared where and when you least expected it. There was another crucial aspect: longships were surprisingly silent when moved only by oar. Experienced sailors could make these vessels glide through water during the night with almost no sound, allowing devastating surprise attacks at dawn. Being a medieval monk, waking for morning prayers, only to discover that your abbey was surrounded by hundreds of Norse warriors who appeared from nowhere during the night, created a psychological advantage that cannot be underestimated. Behind this naval supremacy was something even more impressive: a system of nautical knowledge that the Vikings developed over generations. They created an information network that covered from the coasts of Greenland to the Black Sea. Each Viking expedition brought back not only riches, but information about currents, seasonal winds, location of safe ports, and perhaps most important, intelligence about potential targets. When they attacked, it was not by chance. It was based on careful reconnaissance and strategic planning. Viking navigators developed sophisticated celestial navigation techniques, using the sun, stars, and even wave patterns to orient themselves on the open sea. Legends speak of sunstones, possibly calcite crystals, that helped locate the sun even on cloudy days. All this technology would be useless without the men to operate it. The crew of these ships literally represented the elite of Scandinavian warriors. Not just anyone could be accepted on a Viking expedition. Rowing a longship for hours through stormy seas required extraordinary physical strength. Navigating unknown waters demanded supernatural courage, and fighting on distant beaches surrounded by enemies required exceptional martial skill. It was, in essence, a process of military natural selection. Only the best, strongest, and most courageous survived the first expeditions. Those who returned were combat-tested veterans, with international experience and wealth to equip themselves even better. There was something more that made Vikings unique among medieval warriors: their international experience. While a typical Frankish soldier might spend his entire life fighting only against similar neighbors, a Viking veteran had faced Saxons in England, Berbers in Spain, Slavs in Russia, and even Arabs in the Mediterranean. This exposure to different combat styles, tactics and technologies made them adaptable in a way that their contemporaries simply could not match. They absorbed the best practices from each culture they encountered, constantly evolving and perfecting their own techniques. When Harald Hardrada returned from his career in the Byzantine Empire, for example, he brought with him not only immense riches, but knowledge of Byzantine siege tactics, Greek military engineering, and strategies he had learned fighting Muslims in the Mediterranean. The first great secret of Viking supremacy was emerging: their extraordinary adaptability. They were not just fierce warriors, they were constant military innovators. Unlike many military cultures that clung to rigid traditions, the Vikings treated war as an evolving science. Each expedition was an experiment, each battle a lesson, each defeat an opportunity to learn and improve. This adaptive mentality extended to all aspects of their military approach. They could function equally well as maritime raiders, heavy infantry warriors, improvised cavalry, or siege forces, whatever the situation required. The Vikings had discovered something that would change the world: that war was not just about brute force, but about innovation, adaptation, and the courage to embrace the unknown. They created technological advantages that their enemies took decades to understand, much less match. Their naval supremacy gave them incomparable strategic mobility, allowing them to choose when, where, and how to fight. Their international experience kept them constantly learning and evolving, and their adaptive mentality meant they never became trapped by obsolete tactics. But this was only the beginning. The naval and strategic innovations we have explored were merely the foundation of their supremacy. The true secret of their domination lay in how they fought once they reached the battlefield, in their revolutionary tactics, innovative weapons, and the psychology of war that terrorized enemies before the first blow was even struck. When we speak of Viking superiority, we must understand that they not only fought differently, they thought differently about war. While most medieval armies still operated with relatively simple mentalities of finding the enemy and attacking, the Vikings developed a sophisticated approach that combined multiple tactical dimensions. The heart of their military philosophy can be summarized in one word: flexibility. They rejected the rigidity that characterized many armies of the time, preferring to constantly adapt to the circumstances of the moment. It was an almost modern approach to combat, centuries before its time. This flexibility manifested in several ways. First, in the ability to quickly alternate between different combat formations as needed. Second, in the skill to seamlessly integrate naval and terrestrial elements in a single operation. And third, perhaps most important, in the willingness to abandon traditional tactics when the situation demanded innovation. At the center of Viking tactics was a formation that would become legendary: the scaled or shield wall. But unlike the rigid phalanxes of the Greeks or the Roman testudo formations, the Viking wall was a living creature, adaptable and devastatingly effective. A human barrier, where warriors positioned themselves shoulder to shoulder, their round shields overlapping to create an almost impenetrable wall. But this was not just a defensive formation, it was a multi-purpose tactical platform that could quickly transition between defense, attack, and movement. What made the Scaleborg unique was its tactical depth. The first line consisted of the most experienced and well-armed warriors, equipped with reinforced shields and long spears. Behind them, a second line of warriors with even longer spears could attack through the gaps between shields. A third line often carried war axes or swords, ready to exploit any rupture in enemy lines. The true genius of the Scaleborg lay in its capacity for coordinated movement. Unlike static formations, the Viking wall could advance as a cohesive unit, maintaining protection while pressing the enemy. It could also deliberately open gaps to lure enemies into death traps, where isolated warriors were quickly eliminated. Among the most feared variations of Viking combat was the formation known as the boar's snout or svinfolking. This was not just a tactic, it was psychological warfare in its purest form. A human wedge advancing, with the fiercest and most experienced warriors at the point, shouting war cries as they approached. The formation created an intense pressure point that could break through almost any enemy line, but its true power lay in the terror it inspired. The sight of this formation, advancing warriors bellowing, weapons gleaming, the very earth trembling under their feet, often broke enemy morale before physical contact even began. The Vikings intuitively understood something that modern generals took centuries to formalize, that breaking the enemy's will to fight is often more effective than simply destroying them physically. The boar's snout formation did both simultaneously. Unlike many military cultures that depended primarily on one or two main weapons, the Vikings developed a diversified arsenal that maximized tactical effectiveness. The most common weapon, and perhaps most underestimated, was the spear. Simple to manufacture, easy to use, and devastatingly effective, the Viking spear was the backbone of their infantry. With shafts of 2 to 3 meters, they allowed warriors to attack enemies while maintaining safe distance. More importantly, they were relatively cheap to produce, allowing even warriors of modest resources to equip themselves adequately. There was intelligent diversity in these spears. Some were designed specifically for throwing, with smaller points and balanced shafts. Others were for hand-to-hand combat, with larger points and more robust shafts. This specialization allowed sophisticated tactics where different types of spears were used at different moments of battle. If the spear was the practical heart of the Viking arsenal, the axe was its soul. More than a weapon, the axe represented Norse military philosophy, versatile, brutal when necessary, but also a tool of construction and creation. The Viking axe evolved from simple agricultural tools to sophisticated weapons of war. The famous Danish axe could have a handle over a meter long, allowing devastating blows that could split shields, break armor, and in skilled hands even cut through multiple layers of protection. What made the axe truly special was its tactical versatility. It could be used to attack, defend, or even as a siege tool to break gates and walls. A skilled warrior could use the handle to block attacks, the blade to cut, and the weight of the head for blunt strikes. There was something more. The axe was psychologically intimidating in a way that swords were not. The sound of an axe blade breaking through a wooden shield was distinctive and terrifying. It was the sound of imminent destruction. Although spears and axes were the working weapons of the Vikings, the sword remained the ultimate symbol of status and skill. Possessing a quality sword was a declaration. Here was a warrior of resources, experience, and prestige. Viking swords were works of art as much as weapons of war. Many were named, treated almost like living entities with their own personalities. Bonebreaker, Blood Drinker, Light of War. These names reflected the intimate relationship between warrior and weapon. Technically, Viking swords represented the state-of-the-art in medieval metallurgy. Using techniques like pattern forging, where different types of iron were folded and hammered together, Norse smiths created blades that were simultaneously flexible and hard, a crucial combination for survival in combat. The sword allowed a type of individual combat that perfectly complemented Viking formation tactics. When lines broke and battle dissolved into personal duels, sword skill often determined who would live to fight another day. We come to perhaps the most fascinating and misunderstood aspect of Viking warfare, the legendary berserkers. These warriors became so mythical that it's easy to forget they were real phenomena, documented not only in Norse sagas, but in the chronicles of their terrified enemies. The word berserker can mean bare shirt or bare chest, and both interpretations give us clues about these extraordinary warriors. Some historians believe they fought wearing bear or wolf skins, channeling the wild spirit of these animals. Others suggest they fought with little or no armor, a demonstration of courage that was simultaneously practical and psychological. What really happened when a berserker entered their legendary fury state? Contemporary sources describe warriors who seemed immune to pain, who roared like wild animals, who attacked with such ferocity that enemies simply fled in terror. Modern science offers some possible explanations. Some researchers suggest the use of hallucinogenic substances like the Amanita muscaria mushroom. Others point to techniques of self-hypnosis, intense psychological conditioning, or simply the effects of extreme adrenaline combined with religious fanaticism. Regardless of the exact mechanism, berserkers represented something unique in medieval warfare. Warriors specialized in psychological warfare through extreme intimidation. They were typically positioned at the front of Viking formations, where their apparently supernatural fury could break enemy morale before combat even began. There was a more subtle tactic at play as well. Berserkers served as shock absorbers, drawing enemy attacks and creating confusion that more conventional warriors could exploit. It was a primitive but effective form of special warfare. Berserkers were not undisciplined warriors. Evidence suggests they were often members of elite groups, bodyguards of jarls and kings. Their fury was directed and controlled, unleashed at the appropriate tactical moment for maximum effect. There were costs. Historical sources indicate that berserkers often suffered from social problems outside of combat, with some being banished or killed for violent behavior in peacetime. It was a high price to pay for military effectiveness. Beyond formations and weapons, the Vikings developed particular mastery in surprise tactics that perfectly complemented their naval advantages. They understood that sudden and unexpected appearance could be worth more than numerical superiority. Their dawn attacks became legendary. Sailing silently during the night, they appeared with the first light of day, when sentries were tired and most people still slept. It wasn't just a matter of catching the enemy off guard, it was about maximizing the psychological shock of the attack. They also developed hit-and-run tactics that completely confused enemies accustomed to more conventional combat. A Viking group could attack fiercely, cause significant damage, and then disappear before an organized response could be mounted. This tactical flexibility was possible due to their superior naval mobility, but also reflected a fundamentally different military mentality. They saw no dishonor in tactical retreat. They saw intelligence. A frequently overlooked aspect of Viking supremacy was their sophisticated intelligence gathering system. Before attacking, they gathered extensive information about their targets, defenses, riches, escape routes, and crucially, ideal timing for attack. Viking merchants often served as unwitting spies, mapping territories and assessing opportunities during their peaceful trading voyages. When raiders arrived months later, they already knew exactly where to attack, and when this meticulous preparation demystifies the image of Vikings as impulsive barbarians. In reality, they were methodical planners who combined careful reconnaissance with devastating execution. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of Viking military supremacy was their ability to absorb and adapt tactics and technologies from other cultures. They had no false pride that prevented them from learning from enemies. In England, they quickly adopted Anglo-Saxon fortifications. In the Mediterranean, they incorporated Byzantine siege tactics. In Russia, they learned mounted combat from steppe peoples. This constant synthesis of military knowledge kept them always ahead of more traditionalist adversaries. The most sophisticated aspect of Viking supremacy was their mastery of psychological warfare. They intuitively understood that breaking enemy morale was often more valuable than simply killing them. The very arrival of Vikings was orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. The Drakars appeared on the horizon, like omens of destruction, their dragon prows cutting through waters like sea monsters. The rhythmic sound of oars created an ominous soundtrack that announced the approach of terror. Once on land, they amplified this effect through deafening war cries, the metallic clatter of weapons against shields, and the terrifying sight of berserkers apparently possessed by animal spirits. It was theatre as much as war, as a carefully calculated performance to destroy the will to resist. Vikings developed a deliberate reputation for implacable ferocity. Stories of their brutality spread faster than their own expeditions, often causing targets to surrender without a fight. It was a form of economic warfare. Why spend energy fighting when reputation alone could guarantee victory? Behind all this tactical sophistication was something even deeper, a belief system that transformed ordinary warriors into apparently supernatural forces. Norse religion did not merely tolerate violence, it celebrated it as a path to eternal glory. The concept of Valhalla, the hall of heroic dead where warriors who died in battle feasted eternally, created a unique type of soldier. Here were men who genuinely did not fear death, because they believed that dying gloriously in combat was literally the best thing that could happen to them. This mentality produced a type of courage that was almost impossible for Christian enemies to understand or combat. How do you intimidate someone who sees death in battle as a divine promotion? How do you break the morale of warriors who believe that fleeing combat would condemn them to an eternity of shame? Odin, the All-Father, was himself a warrior god, clever, implacable, willing to use any tactic necessary to win. His followers saw no contradiction between honor and cunning, between courage and pragmatism. This synthesis created warriors who were simultaneously noble and terribly effective. It would be a mistake to think that Vikings were just killing machines motivated by religion. They operated within a sophisticated honor code that regulated when, where, and how violence was appropriate. Viking society valued courage, loyalty, and generosity as much as martial skill. A warrior who betrayed his companions, or who attacked the defenseless without reason, would lose the respect of his peers. Violence had to be directed and justified to maintain social legitimacy. This code created an internal discipline that was crucial for military success. Viking expeditions often lasted months or years, taking small groups of men through hostile territories and stressful situations. Without strong social cohesion, these groups would have disintegrated quickly. The concept of luck was also important. Vikings believed that some individuals possessed special luck that benefited not only themselves, but everyone around them. Lucky leaders attracted followers, and battlefield successes increased this reputation, creating a cycle of growing morale. One of the most impressive characteristics of the Vikings was their willingness to constantly evolve and adapt their tactics. Unlike many military cultures that clung to time-tested traditions, the Norse treated war as an experimental science. Each expedition was an opportunity to learn. Tactics that worked were refined and disseminated. Methods that failed were quickly abandoned. This mentality of continuous improvement kept them constantly ahead of more conservative adversaries. When they began encountering more sophisticated stone castles in Western Europe, they quickly developed siege techniques. When they faced more organized heavy cavalry, they adapted their formations. When Christendom began coordinating more effective defenses, they expanded their operations to new territories. As the centuries passed, something fascinating happened with Viking military culture. The same men who had terrorized Europe as raiders gradually transformed into rulers and administrators. But they brought with them the tactical lessons learned in decades of war. The great heathen army that invaded England in the 860s represented this evolution. They were no longer opportunistic raiding bands, but an organized military force with clear political objectives. They wanted territory, not just riches. This transition required additional tactical adaptation. Governing territory required static defense, civil administration, and diplomacy, different but complementary skills to their traditional military expertise. Notably, they made this transition with remarkable success. When the Viking Age finally came to an end, traditionally dated with the death of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in 1066, their impact on European warfare remained permanent. The naval tactics they developed influenced shipbuilding for centuries. Their infantry formations were studied and adapted by later medieval armies. Their use of psychological warfare became part of the standard military repertoire. More fundamentally, they demonstrated that innovation, adaptability, and sophisticated tactical thinking could overcome apparent advantages in numbers or resources. It was a lesson that would reverberate through military history. This leads us to a fascinating question. If the Vikings were so militarily superior, why did their era come to an end? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of military advantage. Paradoxically, Viking success itself contributed to their decline. As they established themselves as rulers in conquered territories, they gradually lost the advantages that had made them formidable. Permanent settlements meant less mobility. Administrative responsibilities meant less time for military innovation. Simultaneously, their enemies were learning. Tactics that had been revolutionary in the 9th century were familiar in the 11th. Christian Europe developed countermeasures, coordinated defense systems, improved ships and mines. Crucially, the willingness to adopt Viking innovations themselves. Furthermore, the gradual Christianization of Scandinavia changed the mentality that had fueled Viking warrior culture. When Valhalla was replaced by Christian heaven, when Odin gave way to Christ, the unique religious motivation that had driven the Vikings began to disappear. The Vikings demonstrated that military advantage rarely comes from a single source, but from the intelligent synthesis of multiple factors: superior technology, innovative tactics, psychological preparation, adaptive flexibility, and minds perhaps most important, the willingness to constantly question and improve established methods. They also illustrated that military advantage is inherently temporary. What makes a force supreme in one era can become a disadvantage in the next. Adaptation must be constant, or decay is inevitable. The most profound lesson may be about the nature of innovation itself. The Vikings were not successful because they were bigger, stronger, or more numerous than their enemies. They were successful because they thought differently about war, because they were willing to embrace change, and because they had the courage to challenge established conventions. Today, more than 1,000 years later, when modern ships cut through the same seas that once knew Viking dragon prows, we can still feel the echo of their presence. Not just in genes or culture, but in the very conceptions of how war can be conducted. They reminded us that military superiority is not a permanent state, but a dynamic process of adaptation and innovation. They showed that small groups of highly motivated and well-organized individuals can have disproportionate impact on history, and perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that true military supremacy comes not from avoiding change, but from embracing it, for us to see new possibilities, and having the courage to act upon them. When the mists of history finally close over our exploration of Viking supremacy, we carry with us these eternal lessons. In a world that continues to change rapidly, where new technology and tactics emerge constantly, the Viking approach, flexible, adaptive, always learning remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. The Vikings may have departed, but their legacy in the art of war continues to whisper through the winds of time, reminding us that true strength comes not from rigidity, but from the capacity to evolve, adapt, and always be ready for the next unknown horizon. In the calm waters of these ancestral fjords, where the distant sounds of oars and the murmur of waves against wooden hulls still echo, we find the final answer to our question. The Vikings were superior, not because they were born warriors, but because they chose to become something more, innovators, adapters, and masters of the ever-evolving art we call war.